So that white matter now on the outside is basically afferent and efferent nerve fiber tracts. And it's white because it's myelinated. So it's got this fat little wrapping around it. The afferent ones, or the sensory ones, they're right here. They are blue in this chart, and they bring information into the brain. And the descending ones, the efferent, are motor pathways carrying tracts, and they go out of the central nervous system, brain, to the body. When we look at their naming, we name them according to their origin and their destination. So that's kind of cool, because that way you can kind of figure out as you see the name where that stuff's going, and you don't have to memorize everything, just some of it. When we look at neural pathways within those tracts, they're all sensory or motor, and the sensory ones are tracts that have 3 neurons, or pathways that have 3 neurons. So what happens is when you feel like, let's say this is a touch receptor right here. So you like get a press, somebody presses and you feel a touch. The first neuron goes in right here to the spinal cord level, and then it goes up the spine, and it actually then synapses, goes to a different neuron, and it goes as a second neuron up the spine to that place that we call the thalamus. Remember that place from last chapter? And then from the thalamus, it projects to the cerebral cortex for conscious integration. So that's 3 neurons. So they call that pathway a 3-neuron pathway. First order, second order, third order. The motor pathways, the ones that go down, have only 2 neurons. So they come down from, well, this is here from the pituitary gland, but we'll call them from the cortex. They come down, and one neuron goes down to the spinal cord, and at the spinal cord level, that's where we have a synapse, and then we go to the effector organ, which is, as we said before, a muscle, another nerve, or a gland. Most of the tracts decussate, and that means they cross over to the other side. The sensory tract, a lot of them cross over at the spinal cord level, and the motor tracts, a lot of them cross over at the medulla-oblongata level. Internally, the tracts are very precisely organized and reflect an orderly map of the body. You could see that. You could see how we can organize everything up here. We see where the sacral segments go through, the lumbar, and so forth. They call that somatotopy, that arrangement ability. It's like a map. Topographical map. So let's talk about a few tracks. So first we've got to look at the ascending ones, the sensory ones. I got a few here that I outlined. One is known as the spinocerebellar tract. Those send info about muscle and tension stretch, and they go through the cerebellum. So they're unconscious. So you see here, spino means spine, and the cerebellar means cerebellum. So you know they send stuff to the cerebellum, and then the cerebellum processes what goes on. This is like when you fall down into the pothole and you have to balance. That's where that stuff goes up. And then we got some that carry discriminative touch and proprioceptive impulses that travel through here. So that's sort of funiculus. They call them, well, sometimes tracts they call them funiculus too, which means rope, actually. And then the one that we want to know here, so this one is not really named after the origin and destination. That one you would just have to memorize. But most of them are. Look at this one, spinothalamic tract. That's a cool one. That's the one right here. That's conscious sensation of pain, temperature, and coarse touch that goes through this tract, up the spine. This is the brainstem here, upwards to the thalamus, as we said before multiple times. And from there, it gets relayed to the appropriate region of the post-central gyrus, which is where the somatosensory cortex lies. So that's where we're going to have conscious perception of the stimulus that comes in. When we look at ascending pathways, a lot of them control skeletal muscles. So we call that tract, one of the names is cortical-spinal tract. So you see cortical, that means cortex in the brain, right here, cortical. That means the cortex in the brain. And then you see spinal, that's the spine. So you know it goes from the cortex to the spine. Therefore, you know it's a motor pathway. The other name for that tract is the pyramidal tract. That's because these neuron cell bodies up there look like upside down little pyramids or triangles. And so that's why they named it that way. We saw that pyramidal tract in the front of the medulla oblongata as it travels from the brain to the spinal cord, which is where that tract crosses over. That's the decussation. See the medullary pyramid? That's where that is. And then as we get down to the bottom, at the spinal cord level where we need to go to then exit the body into the muscle, that's where we have a synapse and we get to a second order neuron. So in the motor tracts, we got a first order neuron on top, they call that, an upper motor neuron, they also call that. And then below, from the spinal cord to the muscle, we have what they call a lower motor neuron. And of course, if we want to go turn on a light switch, we have this voluntary muscle movement we want to do, we're going to have a few things happening. Number one, we want to walk, and we don't have to want to think about putting one leg in front of the other all the time. So we have these automated rhythmic motion patterns, and that's governed in this basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia is going to influence that initial motor command that we want to go turn on a light or something like that. And then we also have brainstem nuclei that we talked about, the substantia nigra, the red nucleus, they influence motions. And of course, the big one is the cerebellum, and that's a balancing. And so the way I see that is like when I walk and I fall into a pothole and I'm not falling because I'm balancing out, that's the cerebellum talking. So that's a very, very fast reactive system. So it's crucial for coordinating this voluntary motion through these corrective commands. And what's actually cool about the cerebellum, it receives a copy of the planned motion through what's known as the corticocerebellar tracts. Again, the name makes sense on that one. And then it fine-tunes muscle actions by then assessing also stimuli that come in through stretch receptors in the joints and in the muscles. And those are traveled through that spinocerebellar tract that we identified on the previous slide. So that's kind of neat, I think. Now, we talked about this upper motor neuron and motor neuron before on the previous slides, 2 slides back, upper and lower motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron is the one from the cortex all the way down to the spinal cord level. And then the lower motor neuron goes from the spinal cord level to the muscle. And so when we look at lesions, this is a place where we can sort of get a clue a bit better of how things work, but also we get a clue when we see a person what kind of lesion they might have. And so when the upper motor neuron is leased by like an infarct or by a spinal cord severing or something like that, that's bad, then what happens down here, the lower motor neuron actually is always activated and is rhythmically a reflex itself. And so that's kind of interesting, because what happens when we don't have the upper motor neuron firing, the lower motor neuron just goes haywire and all the muscles spasm up. And they call this spastic paralysis. And this look right here, where you see that elbow bent really heavily and then the wrist is bent again, that's when that happens, because when these muscles fire unimpededly, and again, they're like rhythmically always sort of wanting to fire. This is kind of the weird thing that a lot of times in neurology, we think about a motor commands get sent, but we can send a motor command also by toning down something that always works, or by letting something work. And so a lot of these motions in the body are actually reflex driven, and then they are altered by whatever the motor commands are. I know it gets a little complicated. But that's why when the upper motor neuron is broken, the lower motor neuron just fires ongoingly. And the muscles spasm up in a fashion that the stronger muscles contract more than the weaker muscles. And the flexor muscles here, the biceps brachialis and all that, and the flexor muscles here in the forearm are stronger, much stronger than the extensor muscles and therefore that's the look that you get. So they overpower it. But you just see that position, and you put yourself in that position and hold it real tight for a while. It starts hurting real fast. So that helps us understand when we see these people that it's not fun. When we have a problem in the lower motor neuron, so we just got a cut somewhere here or down here, we actually break that cycle and we don't have that cycle anymore, and then the muscle just goes limp and it doesn't do anything. And that's called a flaccid paralysis. There you go, little pathophysiology right there. Now that brings me to that ongoing rhythmic motion thing that the muscles always contract until they're sort of told to shut off a little bit. And that's when we get to talk about reflexes. So reflexes are involuntary hardwired responses to a stimuli. And so a lot of reflexes just are ongoing. They're rhythmic. But we can study the reflex by things like when we, for example, bring a finger and we prickle the finger and it hurts and we get ouch. There is a nerve that goes into the system, into the spinal cord actually, and then this is the integration system in the spinal cord right here. And Roger says, Rogers that something needs to happen, and an impulse is sent to the muscle that then contracts. And what it does, it pulls, of course, that finger away from the stimulus. If that's a prickly needle or if that's a heat plate or something, then both of those. So that's kind of neat. So when we look at that reflex arc and describe it, it's kind of like the negative feedback mechanism. It's very similar. We got a muscle receptor. Here it's red. I don't know why it's red. Here's a receptor that picks up a muscle stretch, for example, or a prickly that hurts, or a heat temperature that hurts, something like that. And it sends this sensory stimulus into the spinal cord. And right there at the spinal cord level, it's such an automated situation that the integration happens that it fires right to an efferent lower motor neuron, and that just contracts that muscle to pull that arm away. So a receptor registers a change, it sends an impulse via an afferent neuron to the spinal cord for processing, and then a response is sent via an efferent neuron to the muscle that needs to do the action.